Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're journeying into, well, the heart of some really big questions. We're looking at the moral architecture of freedom itself.
Yeah, it's a fundamental one.
Absolutely. We're tackling this ancient, really persistent query that shapes, not just our lives, but whole civilizations, the way nations are designed.
And that question is,
It's this. Does the moral order, the basic fabric of right and wrong, does it exist out there, independent of us, just waiting to be discovered?
or,
Or is it something we create, something that comes from us, from human beings collectively?
and look, this isn't just some abstract philosophical thing you discuss in a seminar room, not by a long shot.
Right.
How we answer this, or how a society implicitly answers it, it profoundly impacts, well, everything. Politics, obviously,
Well,
but also metaphysics, how we even understand reality.
and identity, too, right? How we see ourselves.
Exactly, both as individuals and, as communities, as peoples. The answer shapes our laws, education, public conversations,
Hmm.
who we think we are.
So in this deep dive, we're going to explore how different modern political philosophies grapple with this, especially how they relate ethnos. We'll define that in a second, the moral order, and the role of the state in all this.
It's really a look at the bedrock beliefs holding up our world.
Okay, good framing. And to make sure we're on the same page, let's quickly unpack some key terms. First up, ethnos.
Right.
When we say ethnos, we mean something broader than just race or language. Think of it as a distinct cultural group, maybe a civilizational people group.
It's like the whole package.
Yeah, exactly. It's the shared memory, the stories, the history a group carries. It's often a common religion or spiritual outlook.
Customs, traditions.
Right, the ways of life passed down.
Yeah.
And also a shared worldview, how they see the world and their place in it.
So you could think of, say, the ancient Greeks,
Mm.
defined by their philosophy, their gods, their city-state structures. That's an ethnos.
Perfect example. Or maybe the shared identity of, say, indigenous communities tied to specific lands and spiritual traditions. It's that deep cultural inheritance.
Okay, and the other key term.
Moral order. This is basically the fundamental structure of what's seen as right and wrong, good and evil.
And here there are really two core competing ideas, aren't there?
Exactly. First, is it objective and real? Like, does it exist independently of us, like gravity or math? An inherent ethical blueprint.
Or is it constructed?
Uncontingent.
Contingent, something created or shaped by human action, by societies, by history, so it could change.
It's the difference between, say, discovering the laws of physics versus designing the rules of a game.
Yeah, that's a good analogy.
So if we put our central question back on the table, it's this. Is this moral order, this foundation of good, just, true, is it real and independent of us waiting for discovery? Or is it fundamentally shaped by us, either by individual choices or collectively, through our cultures and traditions?
And the implications of that choice are just massive for how we try to live together.
Absolutely. And underpinning these two ways of looking at it, there's a deeper philosophical split.
Right. You've got what you might call a realist view.
Explain that a bit.
Well, it's the basic assumption, often implicit, that truth and morality are objective realities. They exist outside of us. Like finding a map of the moral landscape that's already drawn.
So our job is just to find it and follow it.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
Discover the truths, align ourselves with them.
In the alternative.
That's often called a nominalist or maybe conceptualist stance. This view suggests that categories like truth or right are actually products of human minds, human language, human agreement.
So they aren't out there.
Not in the same way. They evolve.
Yeah.
They're shaped by history, by culture, by consensus. What we call right is, in a sense, a human construct.
Like how our ideas about, say, democracy or human rights have changed over centuries. We didn't just find the modern version fully formed.
Exactly. Our concepts evolve through dialogue, struggle, experience. So this basic split, is truth discovered or is it constructed, is really crucial for understanding the political philosophies we're about to dive into.
It really sets the stage. Okay,
Yeah.
Let's start unpacking these ideas with our first framework, classic American liberalism. This approach, which is pretty foundational to the U.S., fundamentally says, yes, the moral order is real, it's universal, and it exists independently of us.
It's a received order, right? Something we discover or inherit, not invent.
Exactly. Where does it come from in this view?
Its grounding is deep in the idea of natural law. This goes way back, but it was really central during the Enlightenment.
And natural law is.
It's understood as accessible to human reason and conscience.
Yep.
Meaning you don't necessarily need divine revelation. Any rational person can grasp or figure out these basic moral principles, It's like an inherent moral code woven into reality.
So truth and morality are external fixed points, like stars to navigate by.
That's a great way to put it. Fixed points we need to recognize and align with, not things we create ourselves.
Okay, so if there's this universal moral law, how does classic American liberalism see ethnos, these distinct cultural groups?
This is really interesting. Ethnos isn't ignored or erased. It's acknowledged. People have cultures, traditions. But ethnos is clearly subordinated to this higher universal moral reality. That's the key.
So your specific culture matters, but it doesn't trump universal morality.
Precisely. A people, an ethnos, can have its unique customs, its ways of life. But no culture is considered above the universal moral law. Every ethnos, every culture, is called to conform to these same overarching moral truths.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Imagine a culture has a deeply ingrained tradition that denies basic rights to a certain group within it. From a natural law perspective, that tradition would be judged immoral, regardless of how old or culturally significant it is, because it violates universal principles of justice or human dignity.
So universal principles always come first. What about the state then? What's its job in classic American liberalism?
Crucially, the state does not create the moral order. It doesn't invent right and wrong.
So it's not imposing a specific cultural view.
Ideally, no. Its main job is to recognize and uphold this pre-existing moral order, the one derived from natural law. It acts as a guardian, an enforcer of these universal principles, not their author.
Which limits the government's power, presumably.
Significantly. And by upholding this order, the state secures the conditions for people to live freely. But freely, according to their inherent moral nature, as understood through natural law.
Like protecting basic rights.
Exactly. Protecting things like free speech, property, freedom of conscience. Not because the government granted them, but because they're seen as inherent pre-political rights grounded in that moral order. The state provides a stable space for people to pursue the good, guided by that natural law.
And this view, as you said, rests heavily on moral realism, the idea that moral truths are objective. Historically, you mentioned Locke, Montesquieu.
Right, and particularly the influence of Scottish common sense philosophy, which really emphasized that ordinary people could grasp these fundamental moral truths through reason and intuition.
So for classic American liberalism, that core question, who comes first, man or the moral order?
The answer is clear. The moral order comes first. It's discovered, not created.
Okay, let's summarize. Classic American liberalism. Moral order. Independent of man. Ethnos. Subordinate to natural law. State. Recognizes and protects that order.
That nails it. A framework built on discovered, universal moral truths.
Okay, let's shift gears. Now we move to progressivism. This is a very different picture, right?
Yeah.
Here, the moral order isn't fixed or received.
Not at all. It's seen as something that emerges and crucially evolves over time. It's dynamic, always unfolding.
How does it evolve? What shapes it?
In the progressive view, it's shaped by dynamic social forces, by human reason being applied to social problems, by scientific discovery, by ongoing cultural development. Think of it as a continuous process of refinement.
Like society learning and getting better.
That's the core idea. We're constantly improving our understanding of what's right and wrong, updating our moral software, so to speak, based on new knowledge and experiences.
Which has huge implications. It means what was considered moral yesterday
might be seen as outdated or even deeply unjust today.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because it suggests that even things enshrined by classic American liberalism, maybe even parts of the Constitution,
could be viewed as potential obstacles to progress if they stand in the way of what's now seen as a more advanced or enlightened understanding of justice or equality.
We see that in historical movements like civil rights challenging segregation.
Absolutely. Or current debates around gender, sexuality, economic inequality. These are often framed as society evolving beyond older, more restrictive moral understandings. The idea is constant forward movement.
So in this view, what happens to ethnos, to specific cultural traditions?
Ethnos tends to become secondary to the big goal, universal progress. Traditions might be respected, sure, but it's often conditional.
Conditional on what?
On whether they align with a current evolving understanding of progressive values. There's pressure for traditions to adapt, to modernize.
So if a tradition clashes with modern progressive ideals,
the expectation is that the tradition should change. Think about a cultural practice that historically excluded women from leadership roles. Progressivism would push hard for that tradition to evolve towards gender equality, rather than preserving the exclusion just because it's tradition.
And the state's role here, it sounds much more active than in classic American liberalism.
Oh, absolutely. The state isn't just a neutral guardian. It's seen as a key agent of progress. It actively helps engineer the moral future.
Oh.
Through major interventions, education is huge, shaping how future generations think about morality and society. Welfare programs are seen as tools for social justice. And crucially, creating new laws designed specifically to steer society towards these evolving moral goals. It's about actively building a better, more moral future.
This sounds like it leans towards that nominalist or conceptualist stance you mentioned earlier.
It does. Moderate nominalism, perhaps. Moral categories aren't fixed external truths, but concepts we refine through experience and societal development. Think about workplace safety regulations or environmental protections. Our concepts of what constitutes harm or responsibility in these areas have evolved massively, leading to new moral and legal standards.
So for progressivism, answering our big question, man or moral order first?
It's man first. Humankind actively shapes and reshapes the moral order over time, aiming for progress.
Let's recap progressivism. Moral order, shaped by man over time, always evolving. Ethnos, subject to social evolution, needs to adapt. State, actively engineers moral development.
Spot on. A framework focused on directed change and societal improvement.
Okay, next up, post-liberalism. This is another fascinating turn. It also sees the moral order as shaped by humankind, but in a very specific way.
Yes, the emphasis here is crucial. It's shaped through deeply ingrained lived tradition, often tied to a specific religion, a particular culture, a particular people, even a particular place.
So it pushes back against universalism.
Strongly. Post-liberalism generally rejects abstract, universal morality that applies equally everywhere. Instead, it argues morality is embedded within specific ethnos, evolving through their unique histories, their sacred narratives, their communal life.
So you don't discover morality through abstract reason alone.
Not primarily. You discover it, or rather it's realized through the specific practices, stories, and religious life of your particular community. Think of it like learning a language. You learn it by being immersed in the community that speaks it, not just by reading a grammar book. Morality is like that, deeply tied to the life of a people.
So the ethnos itself isn't just carrying the moral order.
It's seen as the primary vessel, the primary way the moral order is realized, maintained, and even shaped. The community's shared life, its traditions are the source of moral understanding.
That sounds like it could have some pretty significant implications for diversity.
It absolutely can, and this is where it gets potentially challenging. Some interpretations of post-liberalism argue that because morality is so tied to a specific people's tradition, it justifies or even necessitates a degree of exclusion.
Exclusion based on what?
Based on ethnicity, culture, or religion. If the state's role is to uphold the moral vision of a particular ethnos, then those who don't share that identity or tradition might be seen as outsiders, politically or socially. It can lead towards advocating for ethnos states where political belonging is tied to ethnic or religious identity.
So in a very devoutly religious society framed by post-liberal thought, minority religions might face restrictions.
Potentially, yes, because the dominant religious ethos is seen as foundational to the nation's identity, and moral health practices or views that contradict it might be suppressed in the public sphere.
What's the state's role here then? It's clearly not neutral.
Definitely not. The state is seen as a moral actor itself. Its job is to actively support and enforce the shared moral vision of the people, the dominant ethnos. This vision is often grounded in specific religious frameworks, like integralism, where faith and political life are meant to be tightly interwoven. The state cultivates virtue according to that shared tradition.
And the philosophical roots here, you mentioned integralism, nationalism.
Right. Integralism, certain forms of populist nationalism, and sometimes drawing on thinkers who emphasize historical development and collective spirit, like Hegel, or even figures like Evola, who focused on tradition. It connects back to that conceptualist idea. The moral order emerges historically, culturally, through human agency, but specifically within distinct traditions.
So for post-liberalism, man or moral order first?
It's man first, shaping the moral order. But, and this is the crucial qualifier, doing so through the specific channels of tradition and culture tied to a particular ethnos.
Okay, summarizing post-liberalism. Moral order, shaped by man via tradition culture. Ethnos, primary bearer and shaper of morality, state, enforces the shared moral vision of the dominant ethnos.
Precisely, a framework deeply rooted in specific historical community identity.
Right, let's pivot again, now to libertarianism. This offers a really different perspective, centering morality where?
Squarely on the individual autonomy and critically consent. It shifts dramatically away from collective or transcendent sources.
How does that work? Morality built by individual.
Essentially, yes. It's understood as something constructed by free individuals through their voluntary choices and agreements. The bedrock is non-aggression. You don't initiate force or fraud in voluntary interaction. If we freely agree to something, and it doesn't harm a non-consenting third party, it's morally permissible.
So contracts, free association, that's the basis.
That's the core. Personal responsibility, voluntary agreements. The moral universe is built from these individual interactions upwards.
What does this mean for ethnos, for cultural groups?
Politically, ethnos, culture, collective identity, they are explicitly not relevant categories for the state. The state shouldn't recognize groups, only individuals and their rights.
So your cultural background doesn't matter for your political rights?
Not at all. The moral order, such as it is, comes from individual consent and contracts, not shared heritage. Culture is a private affair.
But what if people choose to associate based on ethnicity, like forming cultural clubs or communities?
Perfectly fine, as long as it's voluntary. That's just free association. However, and this is important, this framework also allows for exclusion based on those lines, again, if it's voluntary and doesn't involve aggression.
How so?
Well, the non-aggression principle forbids initiating force, but it doesn't forbid choosing who you associate with or who you allow on your private property. So a private club, private community could, in theory, restrict membership based on ethnicity or culture without violating libertarian principles, because it's seen as an exercise of private association and property rights.
So it allows for voluntary segregation, essentially.
It permits outcomes that might look like segregation, yes, provided it arises from voluntary choices, not state coercion.
And the state's role in libertarianism sounds minimal.
Extremely minimal. The night watchman state idea, or for some libertarians, anarcho-capitalists, no state at all. If there is a state, its only legitimate job is protecting individual rights, primarily property rights, and freedom from aggression. Enforcing contracts, maybe?
So definitely not a moral legislator.
Absolutely not.
Okay.
The state has no business enforcing a specific moral code on society. Its role is purely protective of negative rights. It doesn't tell you how to live, just protects your freedom from interference.
So for libertarianism, our core question, man or moral order?
Unequivocally, man comes first. Specifically, the autonomous individual, shaping whatever moral rules exist through voluntary consent.
Let's sum up libertarianism. Moral order, shaped by individuals via consent, ethnos. Politically irrelevant, exists only via private association, state. Minimal rights protector, not moral enforcer.
Got it. Maximum individual liberty is the goal.
Okay, our final framework, woke leftism. This asserts that the moral order is built fundamentally through
the lived experience of identity, and crucially, through power relations. It sees morality as deeply intertwined with social structures and historical hierarchies.
How does that work? What does it mean for concepts like truth or justice?
In this view, heavily influenced by postmodern and critical theory, concepts like truth and justice aren't objective universals. They're understood as socially constructed, shaped by power dynamics. There's no inherent moral code floating above these structures.
So what's considered just depends on the power dynamics involved.
Largely, yes. What seemed just in a society dominated by one group might be revealed as deeply unjust when viewed from the perspective of a marginalized group whose experiences were previously ignored. The focus shifts to how power shapes our understanding of morality.
And ethnos, race, gender, these identity markers, they become central.
Absolutely central. They form the very basis of moral and political legitimacy. Your identity group and its historical position within structures of power and oppression becomes a primary source of moral insight and authority.
So lived experience is key.
Critically so. And specifically, the lived experience of oppressed groups is often seen as holding a particular moral authority. Their perspective on justice and harm is prioritized.
What about dominant groups?
Conversely, dominant groups are often viewed with suspicion, seen as potentially perpetuating or benefiting from unjust systems. Their perspectives might be critiqued as biased by their position of privilege.
So if there's a dispute about, say, racial justice,
The perspective of the historically marginalized racial group would likely be given greater weight and seen as more morally authoritative than the perspective of the historically dominant group.
what is the state's role in this framework? It sounds like it would need to be quite active.
Extremely active. The state is seen as a primary tool, maybe the primary tool for enforcing equity and actively dismantling these perceived oppressive structures.
And oppressive structures are defined how?
Through the lens of identity politics. The goal is to rebalance power dynamics based on group identity. This might involve policies aimed at redistributing resources, affirmative action, or regulating speech deemed harmful to marginalized identities.
So for woke leftism, man or moral order first?
Again, man comes first. But specifically, it's the collective identity and the power dynamics between groups that shape the moral order. It's group-centric and power-focused.
Okay, summarizing woke leftism, moral order, shaped by man via identity power, ethnos, central to defining oppression justice, state, enforces identity-based equity and power rebalancing.
Right. Focused on liberation from perceived hierarchies and empowering marginalized identities.
Okay, we've laid out these 5 distinct frameworks. Now let's talk about the real-world consequences. This is, as you said earlier, where the rubber meets the road. How does each view of ethnos and morality actually lead to different kinds of inclusion or exclusion in society?
Exactly. This isn't just theory. It's about how societies function, who belongs, who gets excluded, and why. Let's walk through them again with this practical lens.
Start with classic American liberalism. We said ethnos is subordinate to universal natural law. What does that mean for inclusion?
It leads to what's called civic nationalism. Inclusion is based on shared values, not shared blood or culture. Anyone, regardless of their ethnic background, can be included if they subscribe to the core universal principles: liberty, equality under law, etc.
Like e pluribus unum, out of many, one nation united by principles.
Precisely. It fosters broad pluralism, protecting rights for everyone who buys into that shared civic moral framework. Think of immigrants becoming citizens by swearing allegiance to the Constitution, not by proving ethnic heritage.
So it's inclusive based on shared principles. What does it exclude?
It excludes practices or ideologies that violate those universal moral norms derived from natural law. It's not excluding people because of their ethnos, but because a specific action or belief, no matter its cultural origin, is deemed fundamentally immoral.
Like banning practices that infringe on basic human rights regardless of tradition.
Exactly. It's exclusion based on universal principle, not group identity.
Okay, now progressivism. Inclusion here is conditional, you said, dependent on adapting to evolving values.
Right. It's inclusive in that it actively works to expand rights and recognition for groups previously marginalized, fighting discrimination, promoting equity. That's a key inclusive drive.
With the exclusion.
It becomes exclusionary toward traditions, beliefs, or even groups perceived as regressive or resistant to this ongoing social evolution. If a cultural practice or even a foundational principle, like, say, certain interpretations of free speech, is seen as hindering progress towards greater equity or inclusion, as currently defined, it can be challenged or excluded from the realm of acceptable discourse or practice.
So pressure to conform to the latest stage of moral evolution.
That's often the dynamic: adapt or be labeled an obstacle.
Now, post-liberalism. You flagged this as generally more exclusionary politically. Why again?
Because ethnos is the primary source and bearer of the moral order. Political inclusion and social cohesion are seen as dependent on cultural and often religious homogeneity. The default is to prioritize those who share the dominant tradition.
So it naturally draws boundaries.
Yes, it often endorses ethnic or ethno-national boundaries, restricting full political participation or belonging to those within the core ethnos. Think of countries with strong ethno-nationalist movements, or where citizenship is tightly linked to ancestry or religion. Exclusion of the other is often inherent in maintaining that homogeneous moral community.
Makes sense. Okay, libertarianism. Politically irrelevant ethnos focus on individual consent. Sounds inclusive in theory.
In theory, yes. The state is neutral. Anyone can associate with anyone voluntarily.
But the practice, the informal exclusion.
Right. Because there are no state mechanisms to ensure integration or protect minority cultures specifically, it can lead to social atomization, people disconnected from community. And crucially, it allows for informal exclusion through private association. While the state won't enforce segregation, private communities or businesses could choose to associate primarily along ethnic lines, leading to de facto separation without state intervention.
So freedom of association can lead to pockets of exclusion.
It can, yes. Without violating the non-aggression principle, patterns of social exclusion based on culture or ethnicity can emerge and persist.
And finally, woke leftism, explicitly identity-based. Where does inclusion-exclusion fall here?
Inclusion is focused on empowering historically marginalized ethnos and intersectional identities. It actively seeks to elevate their voices and address historical injustices committed against them. Think affirmative action, focusing on marginalized narratives.
And the exclusion.
It tends to exclude or at least view with deep suspicion dominant or perceived oppressor groups from moral and sometimes political legitimacy. Their perspectives might be dismissed as inherently biased or complicit in oppression.
Which can lead to.
It can lead to societal fracturing along identity lines, a dynamic where some groups are inherently suspect due to historical position, and others are elevated as morally authoritative based on their identity and experience of oppression. It recenters the moral universe around these identity categories.
Wow. Okay, walking through all that, it's incredibly clear how these foundational beliefs about morality and ethnos really do shape everything. Politics, law, society, identity.
It's profound.
Yep.
And really, it boils down to a fundamental philosophical choice, a deep fork in the road that societies confront.
What's the core choice as you see it?
Well, classic American liberalism offers one path. It says, humankind is free because we are moral beings capable of recognizing a law higher than ourselves, a transcendent moral order that we discover.
And the other path, taken by the other frameworks in different ways.
The other path essentially says, humankind makes the law. We construct the moral order through reason and progress, through tradition, through individual consent, or through identity and power dynamics. In making the law, we essentially make ourselves and define our own reality.
Which leads us to a really critical question, maybe the critical question for you, the listener, to take away from this deep dive.
Which is,
if we shape the moral order, who shapes us?
That's it. And classic American liberalism really stands apart here by grounding liberty not in human will alone, but in a moral order that transcends us. It suggests true freedom isn't just doing whatever we want, but discovering how to live in accordance with that higher universal law accessible through reason and conscience.
And that foundation, it argues, is what allows for stable pluralism and justice.
That's the claim, that this transcendent grounding provides a common bedrock where diverse peoples, diverse ethnos can actually coexist under shared moral principles they can all access. Without that kind of grounding,
what's the risk?
The risk is drifting into moral relativism, where anything goes and society fragments because there's no common ground. Or, maybe worse, drifting into the authoritarian imposition of one group's will, one ethnos' constructed morality, onto everyone else.
So it's a choice between a discovered order and a constructed one, with huge consequences either way.
Huge consequences. Definitely something to keep thinking about.